Thank you. Yes, it's 5 years almost to the day that I came up here to get the little certificate that you get for getting one of the SRHE grants. And for me, anyway, that marked a sort of re-entry into being a historian, this time as a historian of higher education. And I think it's worth just remembering at that stage, I remember having a discussion with the late, much missed David Watson, who very much encouraged me to sort of re-enter the field of history, this time in higher education. And he remarked then, and I certainly would confirm this, that there is a huge amount left to do to understand the history and development of higher education, especially, I would say, especially before pre-1945. But I still think there's a huge amount to do. So today it's a real honour to give this presentation. Clearly, the First World War has been in many people's minds recently. We've seen lots of commemorations, lots of services, and I think it's very important to remember the First World War. But I also think in that context it's important to look at the impact that the war had on higher education, on universities. And that's an area that's been very under-researched. I'm going to argue, as this presentation goes on, that I think it was a real turning point in the history of British universities, British higher education. And I think also many of the things and themes that are familiar to us today in terms of how higher education is developing, I think you can actually trace all the way back 100 years ago to the changes that were happening in the First World War. Now, as this presentation develops, I'm going to talk about the funding of universities. I'm going to talk about new courses, new subject areas that emerged. I'm going to talk about the impact of the war on research activity. Underlying this is going to be a theme. The book is called The Impact of the First World War on British Universities, Emerging from the Shadows. And there's a common theme running through this, that the profile attached to higher education, which pre-war was really very low, actually as a result of the First World War emerged much higher and much stronger. So I'm going to talk about changing relationships with the general public, with government, with business, all of which were affected during the First World War. But before I start on some of that, I think it is important that we actually remember the human cost of the First World War for British universities, because it was massive. We don't know exactly how many people attached to the universities died or were injured or were missing. We don't know the exact figures. But it was substantial. It's certainly, we're talking thousands of staff and students dying as a result of the First World War. So, you know, it's important that we remember that sacrifice that was made. I've just quoted there one example, University of Liverpool, 176 staff and students dying at Liverpool, 32 missing, 121 wounded. And in each university, you see these long lists of names of staff and students and former students who are listed as serving in their regiments and so on. The rolls of honour are very moving documents in the universities of that time. And actually, there have been some calculations done which suggest that actually the universities suffered proportionately very more than some other parts of society. The reason for this was that the universities supplied a lot of men as officers. The officer training corps in universities were very important at this time. And the universities supplied a lot of officers, and there was a high death rate among officers. So there have been some calculations done which suggest that, for instance, at Oxford, 19% of those people who served in the war died in the war. So 1 in 5 died as a result of the war. And then there would have been others who were injured, missing, and so on. So it made a real impact, the very real human cost. And the cost goes further than that, because doing some of the research for the book, you start reading some quite harrowing accounts. The wives of where the husband had died at the front, writing letters to the universities, pleading for help with food, with rent, and so on. Very human stories that had a real impact on the universities at the time. And I have to say, it's quite impressive sometimes seeing how the universities tried very hard to support those families and to assist people through the war years. So, having acknowledged the very real human cost of the war, I want to talk then about some of the sort of issues that had a greater impact. I want to track the development of the war. I'm going to talk a bit about the changing relationship with government, and I'm going to argue that the war was a very significant point in the development of the idea of a public university in this country. New subjects, I'm going to talk a little bit about emerging subjects that came to the fore during the war. I'm going to talk a bit about the impact on research activity, and then offer a few final reflections. So, let's just very quickly draw a picture of what universities looked like before the First World War. Essentially, they were private institutions. Most of their funding depended on fee income and philanthropy. They also got some money from local authorities, and they got small amounts from central government, but very, very small. That had started back in the 1880s and was intended really to pump prime philanthropy. It wasn't intended as core grants, and nor did they get anything for capital funding. In fact, there was a very strong view prevalent at the start of the 20th century that public funds should not be used for capital funding in universities. It was for local communities to raise the funds, philanthropy to raise the funds, not government. So they were largely private institutions. Government did not see it as its business to get involved with the universities. There was no real sense of the importance of universities for a national strategy. There was no real idea of that. It was a time where actually government kept its distance. And actually the universities didn't mind government keeping their distance, because the universities valued their autonomy at the same time. So there really was very little contact. There were some people pre-war who took a slightly different view. The classic case is Joseph Chamberlain, heavily involved in the establishment of the University of Birmingham. And Joseph Chamberlain argued that actually investment in universities was as important as investment in the military. And he saw almost a university race against other countries, Germany, United States. But that view was a minority view. Most people in government, most people certainly in the Treasury, did not want to have anything to do with the running of universities. Having said that, the years before the war were important in various ways. You have, between 1900 and 1914, a whole cluster of new universities established. Started by Birmingham, followed by Manchester, Liverpool and Leeds, then Sheffield and Bristol They were all established in that period between 1900 and 1914. So you've got a number of new universities around, quite fragile in a way. They hadn't yet really developed substantial resources. They hadn't developed financial reserves. They were quite fragile, but they were growing and they were emerging. Student numbers, well, if we take some rough figures, somewhere like Liverpool would have had about 1,000 to 1,100 students, full-time students. Leeds would have been a bit the same, Manchester a bit bigger, Oxford had around about 4,000. Edinburgh had about 3,000, Cambridge about 3,500. So those are the sort of numbers of full-time students we're talking about. But it is important to remember that the universities at this time organised an array of short courses, special lectures, evening classes. There was a very diverse range of programmes, and the sort of specialism around honours programmes hadn't really developed at this stage. They saw themselves as offering a very broad range of programmes. Research activity pre-war was fairly limited. Often it was linked to maybe some sort of local business, some philanthropist who had given some funding for some research, but a large number of the staff working in universities didn't do research, or if they did it from their own time and their own resources. It's what I refer to as the research of enthusiasts, because in many ways that was how it was. Government did fund certain research in some areas. So, for example, some funding was given to various universities for research in agriculture, in food, that sort of thing. But there was no sense of a government strategy in any sense towards research activity. And within universities, as I said just now, research was very much undertaken if you wanted to, if you could raise some funds to do it. There was no real sense of university strategy, planning, management of research activity. It was very much a sort of amateur activity. So that's a very quick picture of what the universities looked like in 1914 on the eve of the First World War. Now, as far as the war was concerned, there were really two phases. There was a first phase from 1914 to middle of 1916, and it really was a period of crisis management. Falling student numbers. War broke out in August 1914, so it was the summer holidays. But when universities went back, term started, the start of the term 1914-15, a lot of male students had volunteered to fight, so they weren't there, and a lot of the male students who were due to start their programs in 1914 also didn't appear either. So suddenly, big drop in student numbers. And picking up what I said a few minutes ago about the importance of fee income, big drop in student numbers meant big drop in fee income. And there was a crisis. I'll say a bit more about it in a minute, but there was a crisis. By middle of 1916 onwards, things start to look a bit better for the universities. Some of the other funding sources had actually held up. Back in 1914, they were worried that not only would fees drop, but that philanthropy would stop, and that local authorities would stop their funding. They feared the worst. In fact, those other things didn't happen. Philanthropy kept going. Local authorities kept funding the universities. So we actually reach a period of some sort of stability when there was sort of the coping strategies had kicked in, and we reach a sort of stability. And actually from mid-1916 onwards, you start getting universities, and government for that matter, looking to the future. But let's just start with phase one, just very quickly. It was a shock. It was a massive shock. The universities, it was a hot summer of 1914. They did not expect the war. They didn't have a clue what to do when it started. They were faced with these reductions of income, and so there was a real panic in the universities. They didn't know what to do. They had totally unprepared. Just to give an example, and the book has a lot more examples of this. So you saw at Liverpool a 28% drop in student numbers. And that almost entirely explained an 8% drop in funding. And given the fact that, and this is familiar to us today, given the fact that fixed costs, staffing, represented a very high proportion of the total cost, actually the universities had very little room for manoeuvre. And there were real fears of departmental closures or even whole institutional closures. I think you need to just remember again that some of these were relatively new institutions. They didn't have the sort of background, the resources, the reserves to fall back on. And so there was a real concern that actually some of these universities might close and possibly not reopen. So what did they do? The immediate reaction was to look for savings wherever they could. Staff vacancies left unfilled. Departmental grants were cut. There's wonderful stories in some of the universities of how they went about this. Issues which actually sound very familiar to us today. You know, it was, do we treat every department equally? Or do we actually apply selectivity to our savings? These issues were really being addressed. Big one, maintenance was suspended. They really built funding for new buildings, but also just day-to-day maintenance of buildings really came to a halt. They kept going through reorganising teaching, because don't forget, not only were students going off to fight in the war, but a lot of staff volunteered to fight in the war as well. So various initiatives were taken to keep teaching going. Retired staff were brought in. Women were often employed. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Senior students often taught junior students. All sorts of devices. Quite significantly, some universities began to talk to each other. Can we sort of share teaching in some way? So there are all sorts of ways in which teaching was reorganised to try and save costs. There were in some universities very big debates about voluntary staff savings. Many staff in many universities offered to take cuts in pay to help their university. This was actually, the classic one is Cardiff. Oxford also was another big debate about this. It was actually frowned upon by government, by the universities themselves. There was a feeling, and this wasn't just in the university, a feeling that if people start giving up money that way, that it could have a sort of sapping effect on morale. So it wasn't something that was encouraged, but it was actively debated. But the most important part comes in 1915. And it was the Scottish universities who started this, because the Scottish universities got together. So that's, at that time, 4 universities: Aberdeen, St Andrews, Edinburgh, Glasgow. They got together and they made an appeal to government. And basically they were saying, look, you know, a lot of our men have gone to fight in the war. A lot of them are officers within the forces. We're beginning to, some of our research is of some relevance to the war effort. Please, government, can you give us some money to help us get over these financial issues? The Scottish universities started it. They were very soon followed by the northern universities. That was Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester. And in London, the London colleges also followed suit. So they were starting to approach government to sort of say, help, we need help. The reaction of government, quite an important document in 1915, and basically government sort of accepts that there is a need for some extra resource to help. Government really debated two ways of tackling this. Do we do something now, or do we leave it to the end of the war and then try and help the universities? And led by Sir William McCormick, who was the chair of the Advisory Committee of Grants for Universities, they actually decided to make some payments now, at that stage in the war. And that's a crucial stage. But what you start seeing in the language at the time is, first of all, an emerging recognition that universities have a long-term role to play, that actually they're going to have a role in reconstruction as well as during the war. And secondly, you start seeing this sort of important view that actually government has a role in this. Government has some sort of responsibility. And that begins to emerge in 1915. Now, I think it's important to stress that this was not a unanimous view. The sort of comments that McCormick was putting forward did not win universal favour within government. Now, because there were plenty of people in government who said, well, no, everybody's got to make savings. Universities are no different from anybody else. No, we shouldn't help them. Fortunately, McCormick had the ear of Lloyd George. Lloyd George at this time was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Lloyd George very actively encouraged McCormick to bring forward clear proposals for how to help universities. It's very interesting how some of the views changed when Lloyd George moved on to other roles in the war. Some more hawkish views took over in the Treasury. But Lloyd George was a friend of the universities in 1915. So, 1915, you start seeing the beginning of changes. There's some important messages in this. There was a real tension between this need to make savings and the need to try and help the universities. And how to resolve that was really quite a difficult issue. But there was a growing view in government that universities had a clear role to play, that they had a role to play in the war and they had a role to play in the reconstruction after the war. But equally, it was clear that this wasn't going to be without strings attached to it, that if assistance was going to be given to the universities, then actually government would start to assume some degree of involvement with, some degree of accountability was going to be needed. And so you start seeing this sort of movement beginning to happen, where universities are looking to get some funding from government, but equally government is looking for some degree of accountability. And all of these themes were to resonate throughout the whole war. Now, as I say, 1916, phase one of the war begins to come to an end. And actually there is a degree of stability. You've got, by this stage, some special grants being given to universities. The very long drawn-out process throughout most of 1915 and into 1916, whereby decisions were made as to how much each university got. It was a very long drawn-out process. Accounts of individual universities were interrogated in fine detail. And that was no easy task, because at this stage, every university prepared its accounts in a different way. No standardized accounts at this stage. But you've got some grants being given. Other sources of income are maintained. Some of the cuts in expenditure are making an impact. And actually, in 1916, some universities begin to show a financial surplus, which actually was incredibly embarrassing to them. They went to great lengths to try and avoid showing a surplus, but nevertheless, some of them did. And lovely letters from vice-chancellors explaining how they didn't really have a surplus. There were very sort of very ad hoc reasons for this, and all sorts of quite imaginative excuses were made. Student numbers in 1916 also begin to recover. More women are beginning to enter universities at that time, and also by 1916, some of the men, especially injured men, are actually returning from the front. So student numbers begin to recover. So we enter phase 2. Now phase 2 is a very different sort of feeling, very different sort of environment. These changing attitudes have begun to sort of have an impact. You've got universities moving towards government for one reason, government beginning to look to the universities for another. They get pushed together. But there's also further things beginning to happen. The First World War stimulated a great period of sort of introspection, national introspection. There was a great feeling about, why is this? Why are we in this war? What's happened? Why, and there's also a feeling that we've been overtaken by Germany before the war, overtaken by the United States, that our universities aren't really up to it, that our business isn't really up to it. There's a great feeling of looking to how can we address these issues. And this thinking begins to be seen very clearly in 1916. There's a very strong push, a very strong feeling that universities need to work more with business. Now, before the war, there'd been a sort of uneasy relationship. Business felt that universities were sort of teaching things that weren't really relevant. Universities didn't really want to sort of get their hands dirty by working with business and industry. But there was a feeling that actually this needed to change. We needed to sort of look to more ways of linking universities with business, and also a growing emphasis on science and engineering. And universities, using my phrase coming out from the shadows, were beginning to sort of emerge in other ways as well. 1916, 1917, universities are playing a really active role in the war effort. And I don't just mean many of their men going off to fight in the war. I mean on the home front as well. So universities were doing very active work in hospitals, in disease control. University departments were working very, very actively to control diseases like typhoid, like plague. There were all sorts of scares in the country that the war was going to bring outbreaks of plague, bubonic plague. Didn't actually happen, but there were fears about it, and universities were actively involved in testing samples and so on. Very actively involved in beginnings of social work. There was a real recognition that many of the families, widowed families, or where there were young children, that there were social problems emerging from the war. And you start seeing programs running in universities to try and help local populations, to try and help them cope with the war. You get courses on how to sort of manage money, to cook with very little food and so on. And actually university students were very actively involved in agriculture and food. So students go off and spend days in the fields, harvest time, collecting fruit and vegetables and so on. Now, one of the things that I think is clear from this, another one I should have just mentioned, munitions work. Universities were very active in munitions work. Their laboratories were used for making armaments and making shells and so on. And often you see the local population coming into the university buildings to work on munitions work. So I argue certainly that all these things come together to sort of represent an opening up of the universities, that actually people were beginning to become more familiar. People who probably never in their lives had set foot inside a university building were going in to help make munitions or for some sort of training purpose. And I think that started to sort of break down some of these barriers. Now, all of this begins to take an effect. I've got here a quotation from Alan Kidd. Was a civil servant at the time. And in March 1918, he wrote a very influential briefing paper where he set out some of the issues that would need to be considered. He was discussing the impact of the war and what had changed. And some of these things, I think, still have a real sort of resonance today. So he talks about the importance of science and technology, of encouraging science and technology. But he looks at other subjects as well. But there's some crucial sentences in this, and I've highlighted a few of them. The great industries are not only coming to realise the value of higher education and research, but are themselves willing to assist in their organisation and equipment. He talks about a demand that university education should be made accessible to a much larger proportion of the population by providing scholarships and maintenance allowances. He talks about increasing the number of institutions themselves, more universities. Sort of top of the list at that time were Reading and Nottingham and Swansea and the sort of embryonic Exeter. But he's talking about growth. He's talking about extra funding for universities, for higher education. And very significantly, he's talking about capital funding for buildings and equipment. But I would argue, most important of all, he actually starts using terms like national scheme of universities and higher education. He starts viewing things as a national set of, a national scheme for higher education. Now, you would not have had that language at all back in 1913, 1914. He starts seeing it as a national activity. And all of this culminates in what I refer to as a forgotten turning point. This is a memorable meeting that happened on the 23rd of November 1918, so just after the armistice. It had all been planned much earlier. And it was a meeting between representatives of all universities, together with the President of the Board of Education and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Herbert Fisher was President of the Board of Education, Bona Law was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And it was a meeting to discuss what are we going to do about universities in the light of the war into the future. It was a very important, very significant meeting. They discussed all sorts of things. Some of this sounds remarkably familiar. So they were talking about the changing attitude of government towards universities. They drew lots of interesting international comparisons. Why are British universities poor compared with American universities was the big one. They were talking about funding. And there was a strong view expressed at that meeting that funding should be consolidated and that we needed a block grant instead of all the little pots of money. They were talking about governance issues, the role of lay members of communities within the running of universities. They were talking about how to attract international students. Of course, one of the classic things that had happened in 1917 to help attract international students was the development of the PhD, which was really developed in 1917-18 to encourage international students to come and study in this country. There was a lot of discussion about staffing, staff salaries. How can we actually improve the status of the academic profession? How do we ensure that all academic staff have the opportunity to do research? Links between universities and business, the autonomy of universities. All of these things were actively discussed at this meeting in November. So, this is an important deputation. All sorts of things happen. It really underlines some of the changing attitudes. It talks about increasing activity and different funding arrangements. And it is no coincidence that around this time you see three of the crucial bodies that are going to shape 20th century higher education: the University Grants Committee, the CVCP, and the AUT all get established at this time. Because suddenly the universities are seen as a system. They see themselves as a system, and government is seeing them as a system, and you start seeing these national bodies emerging. Okay, just to move very quickly to finish on a few other, I think, interesting issues that emerge out of the war. A number of new subject areas develop. So the war sparked a great interest in modern languages, especially in the initial part of the war in Russian, when Russia was an ally of this country in the war at that stage, and people saw Russia as the sort of great hope for the future, that we must work more with Russia. And so there was a lot of new language departments emerging in the period 1915, 16, 17. Russian, Spanish as well. It's worth just bearing in mind that the Panama Canal had been opened just a few years earlier than this, and people were looking towards trading opportunities in Latin America, hence an interest in Spanish. Growing interest in business and commerce, and the teaching of business and commerce, seen in a very interdisciplinary way. There's a wonderful example at the University of Edinburgh of a syllabus that's developed in collaboration with a local Chamber of Commerce about a degree in commerce. And it includes science subjects, it includes languages, it includes history, which I'm delighted to see, and all sorts of subjects were seen as important for a commercial training. Chemistry. First World War is sometimes seen as the war of the chemists, and there was a lot of new interest in chemistry. And new engineering subjects were emerging as well. Electrical engineering, the bottom one you can't see is aeronautical engineering, which were all developing at that time. Important time for the professions. Now here there's a very important aspect to do with the growing role of women. There were desperate shortages in the war for doctors. There were desperate shortages in the war for vets. And so you start seeing women emerging in these professions, really not quite for the first time. Well, in the case of veterinary medicine, it was for the first time. There had been developments in medicine before the war, but you start seeing women entering these professions for the first time in a big way. Teaching. Lots of new links developed between universities and schools, especially schools in underprivileged areas. And the development of social work as an area of study to help the war effort. New teaching methods begin to take hold in the wartime as well. Growth of very strong interest in interdisciplinary study. Links with business. Sandwich courses. University of Bristol developed sandwich programs in collaboration with the Wolseley Motor Company, really breaking new ground in terms of the structure of degrees. Some of the conventional patterns had gone. And all of this was sparked by this desire to work more closely with industry that had been stimulated by the war. And there was increasing use of the seminar. This is just another factor I've just quoted here. One of the key things was many of the people looking at the development of these subjects wanted to do it in collaboration with schools. There wasn't quite the sort of separation of schools and universities. And Michael Sadler, the Vice-Chancellor at Leeds at the time, had a great vision for how modern languages at Leeds would cover the whole of the West Riding, and that teachers in schools in Huddersfield and Halifax and Bradford would be part of the university department in a very active way. And it's another example of some of these links that were forming during the war. Research, just a very quick comment about research. There was a new emphasis on research activity during the war. It was seen as something that was important. So rather than being that sort of slightly amateur activity I described earlier before the war, it starts to take a high profile. Committee for Scientific and Industrial Research was established by the government to help bring together, to help foster these links. And actually it made some very important developments. It encouraged and led to the establishment of the Department of Optics at Imperial College. It was very heavily involved in the establishment of the Department of Glass Technology at the University of Sheffield. So you start seeing these links being forged. And with it come all sorts of changes in the way in which universities begin to view their research. So they start thinking about, well, if our scientists are going to invent something or develop a new process, actually, do we get some benefit from it? Who owns that process? Now, you don't see the term intellectual property in many of documents at that time, but that's what we're talking about. So ownership of research, exploitation of research, and you start seeing universities developing in 1917, 1918, protocols about how staff should interact with business. Who does what? Who leads projects? How are they costed? How are they funded? Who gets the benefit from them? And universities start looking at research activity and start wanting to sort of think about it and manage it. And you start seeing some research committees set up in some universities. So just to bring this to a close, I certainly see the First World War as absolutely crucial in the development of universities in this country. The universities that emerged in 1918 looked and felt very different from the universities of 1914. Now, a lot of things, they emerged actually with a feeling of hope and optimism. That meeting back in November, they all left there thinking there was going to be huge amounts of extra money coming into universities, that all these things would happen. Sadly, many of those things ground to a halt in the 1920s, 1930s for financial reasons. And actually some of the sort of optimism of 1918 had very much been shattered by the end of 1919. But nevertheless, the end of the First World War, they emerged really feeling quite optimistic. But some of the changes were permanent. So the changing relationship with government had changed, and I would argue had changed for the rest of the century. The importance of science was another thing, that suddenly people were talking about the importance of science and technology to underpin the economy. There was a wider acceptance of universities. People, a much wider group within the population began to aspire to go into universities. And familiarity had helped along that route. So you see new relationships emerging, new emphasis on research. I talk in my book about the role of the war as far as the development of the public university in this country. others, I might also talk about the birth of modern higher education in the First World War. Now, I've quite deliberately put a question mark at the end there, because I tend not to like quite such sweeping statements. I tend to think things move gradually rather than in big events. But nevertheless, I certainly do believe that the First World War had a major impact on British universities and on higher education. And just to finish with a quote from Herbert Fisher, who during the war was initially was Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sheffield and then subsequently President of the Board of Education. He wrote this, he was reflecting on the impact of the war in 1922. It's a very interesting little pamphlet that he wrote. But I think, it's almost summed up at the end. He says, universities will take a place of increased importance in the scheme of English life. That's one of the most assured results which the experience of this tremendous conflict, the war, will bring in train. And I think he was right. I'll stop at that point.
Claire Callender. I'm fascinated, it's a fantastic talk, thank you so much indeed. I'm fascinated that you've ended up with the quote from Fisher. And in particular, the extent to which we can understand the expansion and the development of higher education without understanding what's happening in secondary education. Yeah. The mere fact we've got the Fisher Act, and we've got the legislation in whatever it was, 88 or whatever. Anyway, so I'm just very curious about that relationship, because I always feel that when we try and understand what happens in higher education, we first of all have to look at what's happening lower down the education system.
Yes. Can I ask one if Claire, before you pass the camera, because the gentleman down here was the first person to put his hand up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was thoroughly enjoyed that. If I can just bring something sort of a Welsh aspect to it, as it were, there's an aspect which is kind of fairly unsavoury, which is the internment of university lecturers in this period, and particularly after Easter 1916, who were either involved or sympathetic with the Easter Rising. And they were from British universities at that time, not just in Ireland. And they were interned in North Wales in a village called Frongoch, which is near Bala. People know North Wales, near Bala Lake, actually. You can go there. And they were held for a period of nearly 12 months, from Easter 1916 through to February, March 1917. And that's an aspect, really, that we know very little about. Certainly, retrospectively, people talked about it a bit in the 1960s who had some experience of that. But it's just a thought that there are aspects, of intellectuals, people worked in the university, and their internment that perhaps needs to be included in this discussion of 1914, 1918.
I think we'll take two more and then we will stop. In actual fact, the gentleman who has his hand up there was also first. I'm sorry, Maria. And then Dale, there's a gentleman there, and then we'll stop with those. If John, are you managing to cope with this, and then we'll stop?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
So we'll take yours, and then give John a chance to respond, and then you would go for a drink.
Hi, thank you for that. That was fantastic. Can I just invite you to speculate what would have happened without the war?
No.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, Nick. Thank you for that great presentation. I don't know anything about the UK system. I know a bit about the German system, and it sounded like it only really took off in the First World War. Now, I know in Germany that they reorganized the German system in the early 20th century, and they were afraid of falling back, and they cleared a whole huge space outside of Berlin to build something they called the German Oxford, So was England basically just Oxford in the world view, or was that a model which started to spread stronger?
Okay.
Interesting.
Okay. I'll give a very quick response to those 4 points, but I'm very happy to I can talk about this forever. So, if any of you want to grab me and have a chat, then I'd be delighted. Anyway, Fisher, yes. I think Fisher's Education Act, what he did as far as the schools were concerned, is crucial. I think some of the impact of that was felt sort of after the war, but it all came from the same sort of roots, this feeling that we need to, that if we are to compete economically, and this feeling that we've been overtaken, we were overtaken before the war by Germany and the United States. Now, okay, Germany is a bit sort of out of the picture now, but we've still got catching up to do. And so you start seeing, the importance of Fisher's Education Act together with what he was, because, it was Fisher who very much drove the establishment of the UGC and drove new funding arrangements. And it was all to this same end of trying to increase the number of skilled people, educated people in the workforce to help Britain compete on the world stage. And you see that coming through in all sorts of documentation. I think also some of it was sort of coming a bit from below. What I mean is, I think there genuinely was there were growing aspirations as higher education became more familiar, so more people wanted to enter it. And I think there was so it wasn't just economically driven. I think there was a wide desire. And you see this in 1918, 1919, 1920, you have these phenomenal intakes into universities. They didn't know what to do with all of the students who were entering. And it's all part of the same thing. So I didn't mention it, but I don't underestimate the impact of Fisher's education reforms at all. And in fact, of course, it actually goes back to, it just links into one of the things that somebody said, because there had been reforms earlier. In a way, the late 19th century, there were a string of education reforms, going back to Forster's Education Act in 1870. And then you see the establishment of local education authorities and so on. So things were building, and I think were building before the war, and actually some of that pressure for increasing student numbers would have fed through. So in that sense, I think that some of that would have happened anyway. Some of the other changes I'm much less sure about. Government in 1914 didn't really want to get involved with universities. It just didn't see it as its job. And universities didn't want government involved in it either. So that was very much the position in 1914. And I think that would have gone on for some time. The war pushed the two sides together. They had, in the end, they had to sort of work with each other. So certain of the trends, I think, would have happened anyway, student number expansion and so on. The pressures were there. But actually some of the more structural things, I think they might still have happened, but it would have taken a lot longer to have got to that point. Where are we? Internment. It's interesting. I know a little bit about what happened in Bangor and so on. And Bangor, of course, is quite interesting because the Vice-Chancellor at Bangor was one of the most passionate and vehement supporters of the war effort. And made some very, very sort of outspoken and comments about universities that weren't pulling their weight and so on. So there's a sort of history to that, and I think you're right. I think it's something which perhaps needs further research. But it does remind me of something else I didn't touch on at all, and that's the whole way in which German academic staff, many of whom had been in British universities, working in British universities for many years, had a terrible time during the war years. And one of the classic cases is Aberystwyth, where a very long-established, very highly respected professor had been abroad, came back, and crowds gathered outside his house wanting to lynch him. And in the end, he was helped to escape from Aberystwyth by the Vice-Chancellor and the University Secretary. He went off into exile in Reading. It's a very interesting story because the university did not want to publicly accept that it was still paying him, but the Vice-Chancellor and certain senior staff sent him money privately from their own money because they sympathised with how he'd been treated and how, the impact on him. And there are similar stories in other Glasgow, Leeds. There are some really terrible stories about how German staff, many of whom had lived and worked in this country for 30, 40 years, were treated in the first years of the war. So, in a way, what happened to the post-1916 sympathisers is part of the same story of some of the really ugly side and ugly feelings that the war can stimulate. Oxford. Yeah, right, yes. For most people outside of this country, British universities was Oxford and Cambridge. To a certain extent, London. But London at this time was predominantly an examining body. So, prior to getting their charters in sort of 1903-4, if you'd been a student at Liverpool or at Manchester or at Leeds, you actually then would have sat a University of London examination. London was seen primarily as an examining body. Oxford and Cambridge were the sort of two pinnacles of the system that everybody around Europe, around the world knew. And, of course, actually within this country. So, you get lots of stories at the time about how some of those new universities that I mentioned, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool, they were being compared very unfavourably in the press with Oxford and Cambridge. And they often had to defend themselves. It's one of the reasons I say they were a bit fragile before the start of the war. And in fact, there's a lovely quotation from the Vice-Chancellor of Birmingham University who actually says that the First World War made the new universities, by which he means Birmingham and Liverpool and Manchester and so on. Because before the war, they had been seen as rather second-rate. Their standards were questioned relative to Oxford and Cambridge. And so, in the war, their effort was widely recognised and widely applauded. But your basic point, Oxford and Cambridge were very much seen as, and especially abroad, they were seen as that was what British higher education was.